I'm not over here blowing up stuff, if I'm not over here messing up my community, what are y'all doing?
A plea for peace. Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, tells protesters to refrain from using violence in his brother's name. An outpouring of support for Floyd's family today. A highly charged moment as he kneels on the very ground where his brother lost his life. America rages. Nationwide protests in more than 100 American cities. The death of George Floyd striking a nerve and sparking outrage. Among the many peaceful demonstrations against police brutality, pockets of violent agitators starting fires and flipping cars, opportunists looting in the chaos. And a look at how the authorities have been handling the unrest. Departments across the country under scrutiny for their response. Demanding answers. The results from 2 autopsies just released as new video appears to show the moments before George Floyd was taken to the ground. Will the other officers face charges? The latest on the investigation. States of blame. President Trump blasts the nation's governors, calling them fools on a conference call, saying they're making him look weak and urging law enforcement to dominate violent protesters, referring to them as terrorists. The National Guard activated in at least 23 states. Protesting in a pandemic, concerns over spreading the virus while large crowds take to the streets, what the science says about the risks. Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thank you so much for streaming with us tonight. In the midst of a pandemic, an endemic has now gripped this nation. The acute issue is criminal justice, but the chronic problem is racial injustice. What we are seeing play out is outrage. It's exhaustion and frustration on the same level as what ensued in the aftermath of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And while in some cases looters are hijacking the message of the protest, King himself would likely highlight images like these. Thousands protesting peacefully in at least 140 cities since the death of George Floyd, demanding change in the name of justice. As you saw just a little while ago, Floyd's brother lashed out against violence in his brother's name as cities across the country are now overwhelmed. The National Guard is active in at least 23 states, and in a call with the governors this morning, the president demanded state officials, quote, dominate violent protesters.
We're strongly looking for arrests. You have to get much tougher. You're going to get overridden. You have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run over you. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate. And you have to arrest people, and you have to try people. And they have to go to jail for long periods of time. Like we're talking about a war, which it is a war in a certain sense. And we're going to end it fast. So be tough.
And now the president is taking the extraordinary step, calling active troops to the Capitol. And if you missed the president's Rose Garden address just a little while ago, we want you to take a listen to it, unfiltered, in his own words.
My fellow Americans, my first and highest duty as president is to defend our great country and the American people. I swore an oath to uphold the laws of our nation, and that is exactly what I will do. All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. And as their president, I will fight to keep them safe. I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters. But in recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. A number of state and local governments have failed to take necessary action to safeguard their residents. Innocent people have been savagely beaten, like the young man in Dallas, Texas, who was left dying on the street, or the woman in upstate New York viciously attacked by dangerous thugs. Small business owners have seen their dreams utterly destroyed. New York's finest have been hit in the face with bricks. Brave nurses who have battled the virus are afraid to leave their homes. A police precinct has been overrun. Here in the nation's capital, the Lincoln Memorial and the World War II Memorial have been vandalized. One of our most historic churches was set ablaze. A federal officer in California, an African-American enforcement hero, was shot and killed. These are not acts of peaceful protest. These are acts of domestic terror. The destruction of innocent life and the spilling of innocent blood is an offense to humanity and a crime against God. America needs creation, not destruction. Cooperation, not contempt. Security, not anarchy. Healing, not hatred. Justice, not chaos. This is our mission, and we will succeed. 100%, we will succeed. Our country always wins. That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them. I am also taking swift and decisive action to protect our great capital, Washington, D.C. What happened in this city last night was a total disgrace. As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property. We are putting everybody on warning. Our 7 o'clock curfew will be strictly enforced. Those who threaten innocent life and property will be arrested, detained, and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I want the organizers of this terror to be on notice that you will face severe criminal penalties and lengthy sentences in jail. This includes Antifa and others who are leading instigators of this violence. One law and order, and that is what it is. One law. We have one beautiful law. And once that is restored and fully restored, we will help you, we will help your business, and we will help your family. America is founded upon the rule of law. It is the foundation of our prosperity, our freedom, and our very way of life. But where there is no law, there is no opportunity. Where there is no justice, there is no liberty. Where there is no safety, there is no future. We must never give in to anger or hatred. If malice or violence reigns, then none of us is free. I take these actions today with firm resolve and with a true and passionate love for our country. By far, our greatest days lie ahead. Thank you very much, and now I'm going to pay my respects to a very, very special place. Thank you very much.
And now just across the street from the White House, and moments before that speech, scenes of chaos. People were protesting peacefully, but right before the president's remarks, they were sent running tear gas and flashbangs to clear the crowd for this moment. The president walking over to St. John's Church, which had suffered some damage in recent protests. He then posed for photographs while holding a Bible, speaking again briefly before turning around and walking back to the White House. I think it's important to notice as you look at his entourage, there were about 20 different people with him, various members, White House staff. None of them were people of color, with the exception of people who were part of his security and part of the security detail. I think that's important to note, just because representation does matter, and that is in part reason for the protests that we are seeing erupting throughout our country at this time. For more now, let's go to Rachel Scott, who was near Lafayette Park, where those protesters were pushed back earlier this evening. Just describe what's been going on the ground there since the president made that walk to St. John's Church, Rachel.
Well, Lindsay, as the president was addressing the nation in the Rose Garden, tear gas was being fired on peaceful protesters who were gathering outside trying to send a message to the president. We were there. We watched as some protesters were kneeling on the ground. Their hands were up. They were screaming, "Do not shoot." They were chanting George Floyd's name. They had signs with them. And unfortunately, tear gas was fired on those peaceful protesters as the president made the trek over to St. John's Church. We are just now 6 blocks away from the White House. There is a notable presence here of police, of National Guard, of Secret Service. They have moved all of the protesters back block by block. We were with them as we walked and got moved and marched block by block. We actually were in one section where police had lined up on both sides of the block and boxed protesters in. Media was allowed to leave the area, but every protester that remained there, where that tear gas was fired earlier, just a few blocks away from the White House, every single protester was arrested. The protesters that are gathering here today, again, are trying to send a message to the president. This is much larger than just the killing of George Floyd. They say this is about a pattern of racial inequality in this country that needs to be fixed. And when you look at the faces of the people that are out here, these are young faces. These are people that grew up watching and hearing about black men being killed. These are people that have their own personal experiences of racial injustice in this country, and they wanted change for the next generation. They hold up signs, they chant, they're trying to share their stories peacefully, many of them even trying to communicate that peacefully with the police on the other side. Tonight, they feel let down, they feel defeated by the president's remarks. What we saw tonight were not angry mobs. What we saw were peaceful protesters before the curfew was instated at 7 p.m. trying to get their message across. Now it is past the curfew. As you can see, this area behind me has cleared out. Still a very large police presence here tonight, but I can tell you from the protesters that I spoke with today, they are frustrated by the White House's response to this. They were looking to the president for a sense of unity tonight, and they are still waiting, Lindsay.
Rachel, can I just put you on the spot for a minute and ask you to, I did the same with Alex Perez on Friday, kind of take off the reporter hat and give me a sense for how you feel as a black woman in the midst of this environment at this time?
It's difficult for black reporters, just to be frank with you. A lot of us feel helpless. Not only are we watching racial injustice and racial violence being played out on the screens in front of us, we are also in the midst of a pandemic. We are at a time when black lives are being threatened. We are at a time when black lives are being killed disproportionately. We are at a time when black Americans are facing some of the highest unemployment rates that we have seen in this country. This is a time where people are hurt. This is a time where people are suffering. Just 2 weeks ago, I was not too far away, 15 minutes from here, and I was interviewing people that were suffering from the coronavirus, that were struggling to get help. Some of DC's poorest residents, where the coronavirus has hit the hardest in this area. And now to see the protests unfold, to see the violent clashes to watch peaceful protesters be arrested because they're trying to share their outrage and their frustration and do so peacefully before the curfew. It's hard to watch. Being a Black American during this time, I don't think I have to explain to you especially. You grow up and you feel the injustice. You know of it. It's part of your story. It's part of the stories of so many protesters out here tonight that are trying to demand for change. And what worries them, frankly, is that if they're not being heard, if these peaceful protests cannot happen, how will they influence the change? What ways can they possibly make an impact? And that's what we are hearing tonight. We are hearing the exhaustion from people. People that are 18 years old that are out here protesting for the first time, Lindsay. Think about how many lives, Black lives, they have had to watch being played out on national television. People are fearing for their lives. They are marching out here for their lives, and they are hoping for change. And they can't help but think back to the images of the civil rights era. Many questioning here tonight if we have made any progress, Lindsay.
Rachel Scott, thank you so much for sharing that and for your reporting tonight. Let's bring in Martha Raddatz in Washington. And Martha, we had just heard from the president, of course, announcing this move to bring in American troops. How did he explain this decision? And just explain to us what this means as far as what can and can't these troops do on American streets.
Well, first of all, the president and the Secretary of Defense especially are using words of war. Dominate the battle space, just as he's sending the military and already has the National Guard in there to go against their own citizens. First of all, the National Guard can't perform law enforcement duties. They cannot arrest people, but they can help local police. They certainly will add to the numbers here in Washington, D.C. to try to help those local police standing between those protesters and the White House or whatever buildings they're trying to protect. But they cannot arrest. They cannot use lethal force in any way except to protect themselves or others who may suffer serious bodily harm by someone. As for those active duty military, because the president did not invoke the so-called Insurrection Act, they also cannot perform law enforcement duties. They can support law enforcement with communications, night vision gear, some sort of command and control. They can do that, but again, those same rules of engagement. Now, if he invoked the Insurrection Act, and he certainly sounded like he was threatening to do that by saying, if this doesn't work, I will deploy the U.S. military and quickly solve the problem. He said before the military has unlimited power. They don't. It would be up to Northern Command to decide what those rules of engagement are, and they could perform law enforcement duties if he invokes the Insurrection Act. We all know about posse comitatus, which means the U.S. military can't perform law enforcement on U.S. soil. But if President Trump decides on that Insurrection Act, he can do that.
All right, Martha Raddatz, thank you so much. The extraordinary actions in Washington come on the heels of a weekend of unrest, the likes we have not seen since the 1960s. The protests, of course, continue today across the country, and with curfews being enacted in many cities, including right here in New York. So what will the rest of the evening bring? Stephanie Ramos has the latest.
Tonight, protesters filling the streets of New York as the city announces a new curfew at 11 o'clock. After a night of looting, the number of police officers doubled. For days, though, thousands have peacefully protested in 140 cities over the death of George Floyd. But this weekend, rage and pain in America. From coast to coast, a weekend of violent clashes. Police unloading pepper spray on protesters at close range in Portland, Oregon. Using tear gas to hold back crowds in North Carolina. Demonstrations turning violent. Others taking advantage of the chaos, looting in major cities like Boston and Philadelphia. In the nation's capital, smoke seen near the White House. Police firing tear gas as people set cars and buildings on fire. The National Guard activated in 25 states and Washington, D.C. But despite the flashes of violence and destruction, demonstrators determined to stay focused and have their message heard.
The focus should be peace. Come in peace, say what you have to do. Say what you have to say. Black Lives Matter. That's the message. Period. That's it. Look at us. Peaceful. That's all. Just hear us.
George Floyd! I can't watch no more of this. I'm sorry, but like, if I see one more name of another brother dead, like, I'm gonna lose it. Like, I'm really gonna lose my mind.
Demonstrators shutting down the Manhattan Bridge, holding a moment of silence in Times Square for George Floyd.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Oh my God.
A giant.
Oh my gosh.
This is very dangerous.
Oh my gosh.
Today, new details about those terrifying moments on a Minneapolis bridge when a tanker truck came barreling toward a crowd. Officials say the driver likely panicked. He told the governor the crowd moved in to help him. For protesters in Boston, another close call as an SUV rammed into people.
Several people just got run over by a car. The front windshield was shattered.
And an investigation now underway after an NYPD patrol car drove into a crowd behind a barricade. The police commissioner saying at times his officers also came under attack.
It's a very difficult situation without a good ending either way. That is on the heels of Molotov cocktails being thrown at police officers.
Amid calls to end police brutality, disturbing scenes unfolding. This one in Seattle, an officer using his knee to pin down a protester until his fellow officer pushes it away. Police in Atlanta firing the two officers seen smashing the windows of this car, tasing the college students inside, then violently dragging them out. And in New York, outrage over the use of force. This woman taken to the hospital after being shoved to the ground. The mayor calling for another officer who pulled a gun on a group of protesters to be fired.
Any officer who should not be wearing that uniform needs to get off this force.
The mayor not mincing any words there, and Stephanie Ramos joins us now on the phone. Stephanie, the governor of New York announced a curfew that will start at 11 o'clock tonight. What are things on the ground like right now?
Well, Lindsay, that curfew will be difficult to enforce. I can tell you, once the sun went down, New York City changed. We are no longer seeing the peaceful protesters that we followed all day today. The groups that we're seeing right now attempting to loot and damage property appear to be organized groups. This is exactly what we heard earlier today from police. We were on Fifth Avenue. We just walked away from Fifth Avenue, where we saw individuals completely covered from head to toe circling the area, eyeing shops. NYPD officers standing in groups on certain corners. Other officers were already guarding businesses where their windows had been shattered. Stores like the Nike store, Michael Kors, all on Fifth Avenue. Now, some businesses are actually still being boarded up like Saks. Now, the actual street, though, Lindsay, was deserted up until about a half hour ago, 45 minutes ago, where hundreds of people, it was clear this was an organized group, hundreds of people descended on Fifth Avenue, young men on bicycles and a few on foot. But you could also hear some of these young men directing the others, telling them where to go, where officers were not positioned. This situation, it got tense really fast, officers taking people down as they tried to get into some of these stores at Rockefeller Center. But it was clear that this group was trying to swarm the officers here on the ground, and there were more of them than NYPD.
Stephanie, that is such a big concern right now, in that the violence is going to overshadow the message of the protesters. Thank you so much for your reporting, Stephanie. Demonstrations continue over on the West Coast at this hour. Mostly peaceful protests taking place in Los Angeles. Here's a live look at one protest, but a curfew has been reimposed after reports of looting in some of the wealthier areas of the city. Chief National Correspondent Matt Gutman has a closer look.
Tonight, L.A. under curfew, shut down and boarded up. For days, protesters marching into the symbols of the city's affluence, places like Beverly Hills, squaring off against police in mostly peaceful protests from L.A.'s City Hall, secured by the National Guard, to the heart of Santa Monica.
What you're seeing right now is police squeezing the protesters. They've actually surrounded us. They're coming in from all angles.
And when that didn't work, tear gas. And on the fringes of the protests, we saw looting. Despite a countywide curfew, protesters leaving the supermarket ransacked, trying to stuff that widescreen into a sedan.
Another store looted, people going in, people coming out with arms full of goods, and police nowhere in sight.
In Long Beach, they were right there as looters burst through the boarded-up windows of that retailer. In Santa Monica, as night fell, police teams finally arriving, zip-tying dozens suspected of looting or violating curfews.
There are opportunists who are tracking where peaceful protests are occurring, and they are then going to that city.
But the mayhem not drowning out the message.
It is about George Floyd dying, but the microcosm is that America has its knee on the minorities' necks every single day.
Matt Gutman joins us now live with more. Matt, give us a sense of what things look like where you are right now.
We're in Van Nuys, which is the valley, the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and I just want to give you a shot of something that we haven't seen in, 56 hours or so, and that's just calm, relaxed police officers. It has been so incredibly tense here. And just about 25 minutes ago, there were hundreds of protesters right here violating the curfew. They were given a countdown. You got to move in 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 5 minutes, and within a couple of minutes, they just dispersed. And so a very different scene than what we have been seeing. Now you're going to start seeing these police officers mount up. They made a couple of arrests here, but even check out the people who had violated the curfew, allegedly, kind of smiling right now, very relaxed compared to yesterday. Now, things have changed. Actually, I'm going to have a complete spin around. Sorry, Lenny. This is a pawn shop, Hart's Pawn Shop. Inside, there are men who are protecting, who are armed with AR-15s. Across the street, those gentlemen, they have a shotgun. Over there, a sidearm. We've seen people with shotguns on the rooftops. Very different scene in terms of people and business owners taking protection or trying to protect their own interests than we've seen in recent days. The spate and the frenzy of looting, and you hear a couple of pops of fireworks here and there, but there's nothing serious. That frenzy of looting that we saw yesterday did not seem to happen today. We also saw it on Saturday, but I think shop owners, business owners took note, and they are now arming themselves because they felt like police in LA County simply did not help them out. They weren't where they needed to be. They were facing off against protesters in massive numbers, but not protecting property. Important to note that over the past several days, there have been well over 1,500 arrests, but no severe injuries. That is a good sign for everyone involved, Lindsay.
You talked about a change, a difference that you're seeing right now compared to yesterday. Have you seen a change, and you were talking basically about the protesters themselves, or the opportunists as well, but have you seen a change in the police response at all?
Not a significant amount. The tactics have been interesting. It's about starting in a nucleus and then pushing everybody out systematically. The problem with that is that when you have people scattered all over the city, that's when the opportunists come. And that's where we've seen looting, not by the protesters, not in that heart of the chants of the protests and people, demanding justice, which we've seen here and down this street, but in the peripheries. And, a bunch of stores have been looted down this street. So the police tactics don't seem to have changed very much, but we have seen incredible restraint. And I think I'll leave you with this. Not only restraint, but also I think police are understanding that they also want to reach out to the people on the other side of the barricades. And about an hour and a half ago, I saw a young woman who went up to a police officer. She was at the protest, African-American woman. She said her 3 brothers were afraid to come. Her name is Devonay Sutton. She's 27 years old. She said, I can be here. I'm still afraid, but my 3 brothers can't be here because they're afraid of getting hurt. And she tried to explain that to the white police sergeant. And she said, not all black people are bad. I promise you that. And they hugged. And that was a beautiful moment. And that gave me a little feeling of hope that we could have a few rough days ahead. That curfew has been extended to the end of the week, Lindsay. But still, people are trying to reach out to each other from across these skirmish lines.
Yeah, certainly need to hear about those moments of compassion during these times. All right, Matt Gutman, thanks so much. And now back to George Floyd, whose horrific death sparked these nationwide protests. His brother's emotional plea, how he wants us to honor Floyd's memory, and the call for charges against the other officers involved. Why prosecutors are saying that the criminal cases against them wouldn't be a slam dunk. ABC's Alex Perez reports again tonight from Minneapolis.
Tonight, with a nation on the brink looking on, George Floyd's grief-stricken younger brother Terrence coming to the site of the tragedy.
Come on, God.
His knees buckling as he approaches the makeshift memorial. Then the anguish on the spot where his brother took his last breath. Then dropping to the street, tearfully speaking to him.
I need you and Pops to watch over me. I know you got me. That's right. Not first. Right. I know what you want.
Terrence turning to those around him for strength, then passionately addressing the crowd, demanding the violence stop.
I understand y'all upset, but like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am. So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff, if I'm not over here messing up my community, then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing, because that's not gonna bring my brother back at all. My family is a peaceful family. My family is God-fearing.
Encouraging people to make their voice matter and vote.
Not just vote for the president, vote for the preliminaries, vote for everybody. Educate yourself. It's a lot of us. And we still gonna do this peacefully.
The younger Floyd pressing for people to keep protesting. He wants anger, he says, but anger that can make change. He also wants those 3 other officers who were involved to be charged with murder.
Peace on the left.
The Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arredondo last night addressing Floyd's family directly on live TV, calling those officers complicit.
Being silent or not intervening, to me, you're complicit. So I don't see a level of distinction any different. Mr. Floyd died in our hands, and so I see that as being complicit.
Former Officer Derek Chauvin under suicide watch and charged with third-degree murder, seen in that horrific video. The Floyd family attorney releasing an independent autopsy claiming his death was a homicide from asphyxia. Just moments ago, the medical examiner releasing their autopsy, also ruling it a homicide, saying Floyd died of a heart attack complicated by law enforcement restraint and neck compression. The state's attorney general now leading the case, vowing to charge others responsible, yet warning convictions might be a challenge.
But that doesn't mean that when we get to a courtroom that it's going to be some sort of easy slam dunk. History proves that it isn't.
Terrence then leading a rousing tribute to the crowd.
What's his name? George Floyd! What's his name? George Floyd!
Before leaving, seeking out a white protester in order to show a powerful moment of unity.
And Lindsay, the governor here has announced they have started the process of scaling back the National Guard. As you might recall, the governor mobilized the entire Minnesota National Guard to respond to this situation. That was some 13,000 National Guardsmen. But after about 2 relatively peaceful days, the governor now says it's time to start scaling back some of those guardsmen that were called in. So that process has started. Now, as for the investigation and those other 3 officers that have not yet been charged, we've talked to authorities here about why they have not been charged several times, and we always seem to get the same answer from authorities, that prosecuting police officers is a very, very complicated situation. They have to investigate, they have to collect evidence. They say that is a process that requires time, because a lot of times they will only have one opportunity to take this to court. That's not an answer that people here want to hear. They say it's taking too long, but authorities say they have to work with the process to see it through. So that is the latest from here, Lindsay.
And now to the debate over who is driving some of the violence amid what had been peaceful protests. Have some violent confrontations and damage to businesses across the country been a matter of anger boiling over, or are some individuals instigating violence for political purposes and simply to wreak havoc? Well, ABC News Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas has been speaking with law enforcement officials. What have you learned today about some of those arrested, Pierre?
Lindsay, we're getting more insight into some of the kinds of people who are involved in the violence across the country in recent days. In New York, federal charges against 3 people accused of trying to use Molotov cocktails to burn up police cars. 2 attorneys arrested, one of them a Princeton graduate. Also charged this woman allegedly with an incendiary bottle in hand, described by police as a professional instigator, who has been arrested in 11 states since 2011 during encounters with police. And Lindsay, just breaking, the Justice Department announcing charges against an Illinois man who allegedly traveled to Minneapolis to riot. They say Matthew Rupert had several explosive devices when he was arrested, and they claimed that he posted video on Facebook claiming that he participated in looting and stating, quote, "I've got some bombs."
So it appears quite clear that there are some instigators of violence in these crowds, but is it fair to say that some of this violence is organic, coming from members of the community?
Oh, absolutely, Lindsay. We have information, and it's clear that there's some undisciplined locals who are engaged in looting and vandalism. Also, criminals who simply are there to steal and loot. So that is part of it. It's a toxic mix involving lots of different kinds of people.
Toxic mix indeed. Pierre Thomas, thank you. And as these conversations take place about how to treat the protesters and who these agitators may be, we recalled the last set of nationwide protests that just happened. You remember the images just from April, protesters bearing arms, assault rifles, walking freely on the steps of Capitol buildings, upset that lawmakers were not letting them go back to work. Different subjects, but the anger over the economic pain being inflicted on those families was as real then as is the anger over alleged police misconduct. So take a look at these images. Now I want to watch the video that you're about to see that took place this weekend in Atlanta of the patients. Take a look at this video that we have here. Those people being pulled out of that car, there were 2 Atlanta college students. 2 officers have now been fired for using excessive force in that case. The NAACP said that this is the exact kind of policing behavior thousands are currently protesting. And here is another live look at protesters right now in Oakland, California. I'm not sure if we have this video. I guess there it is. You see protesters milling about there. Again, looks to be peaceful there. They're looking at Oakland Tech. And we continue to see scenes like this across the country playing out tonight and, of course, throughout the weekend. Let's go now to Seattle. Our Kaylee Hartung is there, where a curfew just went into effect a few minutes ago. Kaylee, what has the scene been like so far tonight?
Yeah, Lindsay, we're nearly 40 minutes past curfew. This is the 4th day in a row protesters have taken to the streets in Seattle. But what we are seeing today is something altogether different. I want to bring in Elijah here. He's one of the organizers of what you're seeing behind me. Elijah, explain to me the difference that you see, the difference that you feel in what's being accomplished today.
I want to start off with, I never intended to be an organizer of this rally. I was just someone who showed up and wanted to support. Things happen and voices need to be heard. And apparently something that I was saying needed to be heard. And people are finally receiving that. So if I have this platform, then I have to use my privilege for good. And that's exactly what I will do. We want to control the narrative of this story. We want to show what we really are, because we're peace and we're love, and we're showing that here in Seattle every day, and that's why I love our city, because we could be like everywhere else. We could be burning it up, and we were for a second, and then we realized that we just get hurt. So I made a promise to every parent out there that their kid's going home tonight, because there's more kids in this crowd that I've ever seen. And they deserve to wake up tomorrow to tell that story, because that's how change gets made, is people have to tell the story. It has to get better. It has to. So if it doesn't, then we're just going to keep having chaos, which is why we are out here for 4 days, because it hasn't changed yet. And we'll be here as many days as it takes. It doesn't matter how sick I get. It doesn't matter how much my voice goes. As long as we can move, we will. And if we can't move, then we'll sit. But we're doing this peacefully. And I'm not going to say violent, because it's nothing to do with violence. It's destruction, yes, but we are not violent people. I don't want the narrative to be violent. It was destructive, but it was not violent. Because at the end of the day, a cop didn't get killed, but some of us did.
Mm-hmm. On Saturday night, we saw destruction in this city. What did it take for you all to organize this? Look behind you right now. Look behind you right now and tell me what you see and what you want that to symbolize.
Don't answer those questions, bro. Do not answer those questions. Looters are not protesters. They're looters.
No, I'm not standing up for them. Watch. Let me have my words. Give me a chance. Give me a chance to have my words too.
Yeah. Saturday was different. We know Saturday was different. Explain to me how you were able to bring this community together to show this statement.
I know that people want me to say that it was looters' fault on Saturday, but it wasn't. We came with the intention to be peaceful. And as soon as cops wanted to act wild and show their force, we wanted to stand up too. It was not looters that made it violent. It was cops tear gassing people. It was a cop who maced a kid. That's what made it violent. There was nothing violent about the looting.
But today, we saw you all working with police. I've seen conversations as you all have proceeded through the streets with police in front of you, escorting you. There was an impasse a moment ago. You all told police you would take one route to get to the police precinct that you're headed to. And some people tried to go another way, but there was a conversation had. What was that conversation?
The conversation was, we're only as good as our word. We keep begging for peace, and if we don't show that we can follow that, then why are we even out here? So your parents tell you all the time, you're only as good as your word. This was our word that we were going to do this peacefully on this route, and that's what we're doing, because it is unfair to change direction for people in that group that don't know what's going on. And I promised every parent out there that their kid would go home safe. When you make decisions like that, you're risking the lives of everyone in that crowd. That's not just your life, and it is so selfish and unfair.
And what is the goal tonight as you approach the East Police Precinct in Seattle?
Our message tonight, when we stand up there, for however long we stand up there, is to show that we are consistent. If we say we're going to give peace, we're going to give peace every time, but we're going to be there. And if you don't want to listen, then you're just going to have to deal with us sitting up there all the time, because we're still out here.
But you want to have conversations with the chief of police, with the mayor.
I want the chief of police to sit down. I want the mayor to acknowledge her privilege, because setting up a curfew to try to regulate people is not the way to do it. We don't want to be vicious with you. We want you to sit down with us. You are a queer member of this community. You are speaking volumes when you're quiet. You're showing all of us exactly what it means to be a privileged, white, queer person in this community.
And this group will continue to march, Lindsay, up this street we're on here and straight to the East Police Precinct on Capitol Hill of Seattle. And they say it will continue to be peaceful.
And just before you go, just quickly, because we don't really have necessarily the perspective of the long lens there, but about how many people would you say are there? We're talking several hundred?
Oh, Lindsay, it is hard. It is hard for me to do that. Hundreds approaching 1,000, maybe more. But I mean, as far as you can see behind me, across the interstate bridge is downtown Seattle. This group is now marching through the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. They wound through the streets of downtown for hours, stopped in front of City Hall to make a statement. And now, as I said, the next destination, they know where they want this night to end. And again, they want it to end peaceful. They want it to end in a serious conversation.
And again, we can't emphasize enough what the gentleman who came up was saying. There is a distinction between looters and protesters. But at any rate, Kaylee Hartung in Seattle for us tonight. Thanks so much, Kaylee. And let's bring in the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkan, now. Thanks so much for joining us, Mayor.
Thanks for having me.
Over the weekend, we saw scenes of chaos and destruction in your city. Dozens were arrested. What do you know about the perpetrators of this violence?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think it's really important for viewers and Americans to remember that the people who came to protest the outrageous murder of Mr. Floyd had every right to gather and to grieve and to demand accountability. And in Seattle, they did that by the thousands, and they did it without any acts of violence. At the same time, thousands of others came with only one purpose, and that was to commit acts of violence, hate, and to destroy property. They caused millions of damage and a lot of injuries. And I think it's important for viewers to know that that is very different from the people who came to protest, rightfully so.
Was the city prepared, would you say, for this kind of rioting? And do you think that law enforcement did enough to protect the public and local businesses?
I think the law enforcement did the best job they could under the circumstances. We see protests and demonstrations in Seattle of all sizes and scopes over the years. We had hundreds of thousands of people march in the Women's March here without any incidents. In normal circumstances, our police officers rarely have to intercede at all. We prepared more because of what we saw going on across the country. But even then, to have over 1,000 people, if they come with the intent to have that kind of violence, the police officers have to do a range of things. First, they have to protect the life of the people there. And having a number of thousands of people there peacefully, they have to make sure that they're protected and can move out of the city. And then they have to make sure that they can move people out of the city who are not obeying the law, try to make arrests, try to put out fires, try to protect property. When you have that many people to do it, it is a difficult thing to do. But I think that our officers did the best they could under the circumstances. I will say we've received complaints about the use of force. And in Seattle, we have a very robust system of police oversight. I was formerly the United States Attorney. When a United States Attorney, I did an investigation of the Seattle Police Department, helped negotiate a consent decree that's in place that changed how we use force and how it's investigated. We will look at every act that citizens are concerned about or residents are concerned about, because one of the things you have to do to gain trust of a community is know that if police officers do act inappropriately, they will be held accountable.
You've imposed a curfew again tonight, but you've also said that Seattle police have not arrested anyone for violating curfew. So how will that be enforced?
So the curfew, like any law, we want our police to have the tools. And our chief of police, in her estimation, given what we've seen across the country and given what we saw here Saturday, the tenor of these demonstrations can change significantly at night. The curfew gives the police a tool to make sure that they can get lawful and peaceable people out of an area, and there they can direct their attention to people if they're acting violently or unlawfully. But like any law, they'll use their discretion and their judgment. We had a group of protesters yesterday who were protesting peacefully for hours after the curfew had been implemented, and the police in their discretion determined that they did not want to use their powers and prevent them from doing that. So they let them protest peacefully for a number of hours and then asked them to disperse late into the evening. So I think we want to make sure that I want to give our police the tools they need, but we also have to balance it against the very important Fifth Amendment rights. And also, we are at a juncture in our nation again. This is a call to justice for all of us to examine what we're doing and how we can change it. It's a time when we need action. It's a time we need healing. But that healing and reconciliation can only come if people have the opportunity both to grieve and to express what they are feeling and the great trauma and injustices in their lives and their families' lives. So it is an important time in America for people to be able to protest. And, we heard from the African-American community in particular, they felt that Their rights to protest were marred by people who were not there to protest or honor the life of Mr. Floyd, but were there simply to create destruction and violence. I think Mr. Floyd's brother said it very well today, that that is not what his brother wanted. And so I think we can move forward, and you can protest, and the content of your protest can be filled with anger and with a call for justice, but it does not have to devolve to property damage, to fires, and to hurting people.
Mayor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Much more ahead tonight on ABC News Prime. The U.S. airline is now planning to take the temperature of every single passenger. And coming up, we're live in Philadelphia. Also hear from one of the leading voices on racism in America. Does he think these protests represent a tipping point? But first, our post of the day. The head of police in Orange County taking a knee in solidarity with the people of Florida protesting the death of George Floyd.
An independent autopsy brought on by the family of George Floyd has been released. Dr. Michael Batten says he found Floyd died of asphyxia.
When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true. I am talking and talking and talking and not breathing in front of you.
If I'm not over here messing up my community, what are y'all doing?
A powerful moment this afternoon, the site where George Floyd lost his life, visited by his brother for the first time.
My family is a peaceful family. My family is God-fearing.
His message of peace, clear. Today, a time of reflection for many, families stopping by to pay their respects at the growing memorial to George Floyd.
Curfews have been imposed across the nation, including in New York City, which saw peaceful protests this afternoon.
The National Guard is currently active in D.C. and 25 states. Sunday alone, Chicago had nearly 700 arrests, 132 officers injured. New York City's mayor announcing his daughter was arrested protesting.
As all 50 states gradually reopen, the number of coronavirus cases continues to climb.
With massive crowds of people marching side by side over the last several days. After months on lockdown, New York City is now preparing for phase 1 of reopening, set to begin exactly a week from today.
We spent all this time closed down, locked down, masked, socially distanced, and then you turn on the TV and you see these mass gatherings.
Across the country, as states continue to reopen, a new policy from Frontier Airlines. Today, the airline now requires temperature checks for all passengers before boarding flights. Any passenger or crew member with a temperature of 100.4 degrees or higher will not be allowed to get on the plane. They must also wear masks and sanitize their hands before boarding.
Today is June 1st, and that is the official start of the Atlantic hurricane season.
But we know we've already had the A and B named storms, and we could now see the C by the end of this week or early this weekend. And it's actually coming from an interesting path. This is El Salvador over the weekend. At least 7 people have been killed. You had at least 100 homes flooded. You can see those cars being washed away there. The mudslides, the debris flows, all happening from what was Tropical Storm Amanda in the Eastern Pacific, then moved into El Salvador, and now is kind of hanging out over the Yucatan Peninsula. There is a chance that what is left of Amanda is going to redevelop over the Gulf of Mexico and sit in the bay here for a couple of days through the end of the week, and then try to go north toward the Gulf Coast by this weekend.
Welcome back. We're looking at live images in Chicago. Again, they appeared to be peaceful images of protesters there. A large crowd gathering. Unclear what is being said in the middle. We see the people with their signs, and it appears that people have their hands up in some of the immediate perimeter of that circle. So we continue to monitor protesters across the country. We go now to Philadelphia, another American city that has erupted in protest. And ABC's Trevor Ault joins us now live from there. So Trevor, that city is under curfew for another night. Give us a sense of what's happening live on the ground right now.
Well, Lindsay, to be honest with you, what we have seen over the past several hours is not what I was expecting when we arrived in Philadelphia today. We still have National Guard soldiers behind me. What you're going to notice in the background, and also if we pan over here, is that some of these police officers are now starting to spread out and disperse. But for the past hour, they've been sitting here calmly, almost taking a collective exhale, because this day has been very different from days past from what they tell me in terms of what they're seeing in terms of unrest and looting. And a lot of them are crediting the National Guard being here. We saw several officers walking by, fist bumping them, thanking them for being here, because they said that it allowed them to cover a lot more area of the city. Now, obviously, there are still things happening right now that they're responding to because of the speed that they just dispersed here. But compared to what we saw over the past several days, things were much more managed so far in Philadelphia, but that's not to say there weren't demonstrations. There were several on a large scale, and there were also, on a few different occasions, Lindsay, some clashes between protesters and police.
And give us a sense of what was taking place over the last few days in Philadelphia. I know it's a different scene now, but what was the unrest like prior to this?
So what we know in Philadelphia is that, like many cities, there were some acts of violence, acts of destruction, and a lot of looting. What I think did make Philadelphia a little bit different than what we saw in several other major cities is a lot of the looting, it wasn't happening after dark when crowds started to disperse. It was happening in the middle of the day, and it wasn't necessarily in the suburbs. It wasn't necessarily in the city center. It was spread out in the suburbs too. And because police were here often protecting some of these more major landmarks, they weren't responding in time. Today, when I got here, there was a massive demonstration weaving its way through the streets here. Thousands of people. It stretched for 3 blocks, and it was organized and it was unified. We do know the main clash from what we've seen so far of a few different instances where police today deployed tear gas was when a group of about 100 protesters from that main group broke off and went onto an expressway, a highway here, and tried to shut it down. And police responded very quickly to that, deploying that tear gas and taking about 30 people into custody. Now, since then, it has been much quieter. That curfew that you mentioned was instituted at 6 o'clock tonight. People didn't necessarily all go home then, but here at City Hall, it's been calm for several hours now, and the most activity that we've been able to see from here was while all those officers were converging and relaxing, taking a break, we saw people marching a block away in the distance, but we could hear them singing church hymns, which was I can't understate the stark difference from what we're seeing today versus what we saw over the past several days. And it is jarring, Lindsay, to tell you the tension that's happening in this country right now, that it is strange to see officers relaxing. I think that speaks to the magnitude of what this country's been dealing with.
All right, Trevor, well said. Thank you so much for your live reporting. And these protests are unique, not just because of the size and scope, but because they're taking place in the middle of the worst pandemic any of us has ever witnessed. ABC's Steve Osensami takes a closer look at protesting in the age of COVID-19.
Health authorities are warning people marching in American streets tonight that you probably should self-quarantine when you get home this evening.
We are really worried that this might be a trigger for more COVID infections.
These demonstrations could be an accelerant and provide the opportunity for there to be more cases.
The coronavirus, which is still spreading, is already hitting black and brown communities hardest, and that's who's mostly in the streets. Atlanta's mayor is encouraging testing.
If you were out protesting last night, you probably need to go get a COVID test this week.
In these 15 states and Puerto Rico, the number of newly reported cases is increasing. Places like Tennessee, South Carolina, and California, where protests are quite large. In Los Angeles County, they've had to close or move coronavirus testing sites because of the chaos. Chicago and Philadelphia have had to shut down food banks that were helping people who the virus has put out of work.
Let's continue this conversation now and bring in Dr. Todd Ellerin, Chief of Infectious Diseases at South Shore Health and also an ABC News contributor. Dr. Ellerin, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Lindsay.
How dangerous are crowds like what we've been seeing the past few days when it comes to COVID-19?
Yeah, so crowds and COVID-19 are a dangerous combination. I want you to think of these 4 categories as far as risk of spread of this virus. So people, place, time, and space. So when we're talking about people, large crowds being close together. That's very dangerous. And remember, a lot of these protesters are Black Americans, which makes sense, but their risk of dying from COVID-19 is more than twice that of whites. So we have to remember their healths are at risk, and then when they go home to their families and friends, they may be at risk of getting severe illness from this. And then you want to think of place. Now, the place is outdoors. That's a good thing. That's a mitigator. But then we have time and space. These protesters are spending hours shoulder to shoulder, face to face. That is going to propagate the virus, and there's a risk of spreading more of these COVID fires. Now, remember, many of the protesters are masked, but we're watching the crowds. Masking is uneven, and masking may not work as well when you have people yelling, spitting. The masks are really, it may not be able to hold on to those respiratory droplets, which may aerosolize when you yell.
Oh, those are all very good points. And if you're set on joining one of these protests, what would you say is the best way to protect yourself? Some advice that you would give to somebody who says, this cause is important enough for me to be out there.
Okay, well, first of all, if you have chronic conditions or are elderly, you really have to think twice. It's safer to stay at home and figure out a safer way to protest. But if you are going to get out there, masking is very important, and I would even consider shields, like welder shields, that really protect the eyes as well, because the mask protects the nose and mouth, but not protecting the eyes. And if you get those infectious droplets into your eyes, that's a way that you could get infected. Hand hygiene is very important as well. Obviously, physical distancing is extremely important, but that's not really, with many of these crowds, that's not realistic.
And amid all of this, most states are starting to slowly reopen at this time. So where do things stand in the fight against COVID-19 in the country right now?
Well, the good news is that most states in the country, cases are declining, but some of that is predicated on how much we're testing. I think the key is we want to take our foot off the brake gradually and place our foot on the accelerator gradually. We can't go 0 to 60 quickly. Otherwise, we're just going to lead to another outbreak.
Dr. Todd Ellerin, thank you so much for your time. These protests certainly aren't the first this nation has seen over racism and police brutality in America, but they are some of the largest and most urgent. And joining us now to talk about the state of race in America today is author and Georgetown professor Michael Eric Dyson. Michael, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Great to be here.
So what we're all witnessing right now is tantamount to the level of unrest when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Why do you think that this specific incident, George Floyd's death, was such a tipping point?
Well, black people looked at him and said, that could have been me. They were easily identifying with him. A knee on the neck is metaphoric for the knee that white America has too often had on the necks of black people. And begging for his mother. How intimate is that for black people? That struck a nerve in black America in a way that has unleashed tons of fury that have been compressed over the years. It was just enough. It was a tipping point that sent black people over the edges, and it continues to unfold in the streets of America even today.
I just want to acknowledge we have a little bit of breakup on the line with you, but this is an important conversation to have, so we want to continue it. In your 2017 book, The Tears We Cannot Stop, you wrote that white people should participate in marches, rallies, and community meetings to engage in the struggle for racial justice. And I was thinking about it in terms of the coronavirus. You know, people are quick to say we're all in this together, but when it comes to racial inequality, that kind of mantra doesn't seem to resonate in quite the same way. What does it take to get people who don't see themselves as stakeholders in this movement of racial equality to put some skin in the game, so to speak?
Yeah, well, some skin in the game is exactly what we need. But the moment it was announced that this was a black disease, that it was disproportionately affecting African-American people, you saw the rise of a kind of white intolerance and impatience that led them armed to storm the state houses and capitals of this nation, insisting that it was wrong to keep them held back. So there was no sense of partnership. There was no sense of common stakeholding. There was no sense of citizenship, e pluribus unum out of many one. And what we have to understand is that if they don't see that in regard to a pandemic like COVID-19, they're not going to see it in terms of a pandemic like COVID-16-19, like the racial fury that has been unleashed on this country 400 and some years ago. And so what we have to say is that America must deal with its racist past that continues to infect and affect its racist present, and people of goodwill who are white have to speak up. I'm convinced there are many more people of goodwill than bad, but they are not as vociferous and as loud and as vocal as those who repudiate the claims of civic democracy for African American people. And until white people can join in fully, now we see some of that on the streets, but we don't need that kind of allyship where, you know, white folk are breaking into stores and stuff, and then black people still bear the burden because of disproportionate concentration on African American criminals. What we need is white people to riot at work. Do it with the CEOs of companies. Do it with, you know, your institutions of American society, the redistribution of wealth. Do it with the kinds of educational opportunities that should occur. So there are ways in which white allies can open up spaces and open up doors that permit African American people to flourish. That's the kind of stakeholding we'll need if this thing is to turn around. COVID-16-19 is very clever, and for those who are unaware, obviously giving a nod to 401 years ago when the first slave ship came ashore to this country. In an essay posted on Medium today, former President Barack Obama said the more specific we can make demands for criminal justice and police reform, the harder it will be for elected officials to just offer lip service to the cause. What actionable demands can protesters be making of their elected officials? I mean, give us a top three list. Deal with criminal justice reform, talk about prosecutors who must be held to account when it comes to holding the police to account. Too often the police and prosecutors are working together, they're in bed with each other, and one, that is the prosecutor, is loath to hold the other, that is the police person, accountable. Number two, we need to have community policing. We need to have oversight of policing as well. It's a two-pronged thing. And thirdly, we've got to figure out the division of labor. Police people should not be sent to handle, I don't know, mentally ill people that they end up killing, especially when they're African American. We've got to find a way in which to defund certain police departments and then put the cash toward those areas of social service that are devoted to helping, people who are vulnerable instead of being treated to the police. Turn to our African American and Latinx brothers and sisters who are of the cloth, so to speak, of the badge and the baton, and find out from them how to handle these matters. Many more things to be done, but that's the list I'd begin with. And just one more, because you kind of touched on this a little bit. This started out as a George Floyd issue. That was the lighter fluid, if you will. But let's talk about what was already smoldering beneath the surface. Some say for decades, but I think it's probably safe to say for centuries, and the broader implications for this now. Because even if those three officers are arrested at this point, does that stop the protest, or has this now widened out to be more than just criminal justice, but about systemic racism? Yes, I think you're absolutely right in your eloquent summary there. It is about systemic racism. It's about structural inequalities, the things that are deeply entrenched into the system itself. You don't have to have anybody standing over you. You don't have to have a white intending person or an intentional racism operating there. It's a kind of deus ex machina, a ghost in the machine. And the ghost of the machine, this case, is bigotry and prejudice and violence toward African American people. But it doesn't have to be an individual desire expressed. It is the system itself producing inequality. And as a result of that, these structural and systemic features suggest that this protest now is not simply about the death of George Floyd. It's about the death of American democracy, decency, and humanity. And it's about the way in which Black people continue to be the victims of thuggishness from an American president and from a government that is grossly insensitive and not empathetic at all to our plight and our predicament. Michael Eric Dyson, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time. Ms. Davis, it's always great to speak to you.
And before we go tonight, our image of the day. Last week, Sean Dromgoole posted on Facebook and the Nextdoor app he was afraid to take a walk in his neighborhood because of violent incidents against black men like George Floyd. Well, more than 150 strangers offered to walk with him because of that post. Sean asked them to meet in a restaurant parking lot to take a walk together, and they did. It was such a success that he plans to invite his neighbors on another walk later this week. And that is our show for tonight. Stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. We leave you now with an image of the Empire State Building, lights out, to recognize the death of George Floyd and to end an urge to damage this city.